Good afternoon and welcome to Radio Control. It's 1 p.m. now and we're having a beautiful afternoon right now. Despite how crappy the weather was yesterday, I think it really shored up to a nicer day than average for Palmerston North at this time of year. Sun coming out a little bit. Anyway, enough with this weather banter. I've brought here with me Shaun, who's going to be discussing his exciting research in the field of psychology and board games. So welcome, Shaun.
Kia ora. How's it going?
Oh, it's going fine. As I said, nicer day than usual. And I'm really excited to hear. So why don't we start with a little bit about yourself?
Okay, yeah, no worries. So my name's Shaun Garea. I'm a lecturer at the School of Psychology. My main focus or research area is a sort of an experimental psych. So I deal mainly with quantitative data, so a lot of statistics and running experiments and analysing data sets, etc. But yeah, so my prior research has sort of looked at mainly video games. So I've done work, I did my master's in cooperation with video games and seeing if when people are playing games cooperatively, whether they end up cooperating more outside of the games themselves, so they can be used as tools. And then in my doctorate, I've been doing looking at loot box research. I don't know if you know what loot boxes are.
I think a lot of people who play video games are quite familiar with loot boxes, but basically it's kind of like a randomized prize draw of sorts integrated into video games.
Totally. That's it. So that's a really great way to describe it. And a lot of these games, you can then the prizes you get, you can then cash out on a marketplace. So they sort of fit a lot of the requirements for gambling. So I've been looking at that in terms of video games and how people are responding to them and things like that. But what I've done this year is I've worked with a colleague of mine, Ros Hebden, and we've set up a new gaming lab at the Manawatu campus called GRAIL, which is a gaming research and investigation laboratory. And this is looking at analog games. So my focus particularly is sort of tabletop role-playing games. Popular ones that people know is things like Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, where people sit around a table, they're playing characters and solving problems together and collaboratively storytelling. And my colleague Ross is looking at board games. So very popular games. I know everyone sort of knows Monopoly and Scrabble, but the modern board game scene is a lot more complex now, and there's tons of different games that are doing lots of different things.
What are a few examples of some modern board games?
So modern board games would be, I think, popular games that people might know or have heard of are games like Ticket to Ride, which is sort of a train game where you're connecting train tracks in order to gain points. There are popular sort of dungeon crawl board games like Gloomhaven, in which you've got like a party of people and you're using cards to solve problems with a sort of an inbuilt timer in the turn, and that you've got a hand of cards. And the more cards you play, the less cards you have. So it's a sort of little puzzle built into the board game itself. So that's just a couple. Or Pandemic, I suppose it's probably really quite topical even now. So Pandemic is a game that was very, very popular. It still is, in which you're sort of a team of scientists trying to solve and eliminate sort of outbreaks of different diseases around the world.
It's funny because actually during COVID-19 lockdown, I was actually playing Pandemic.
Yeah,
I felt it very romantic at the time to be fighting a disease on the tabletop, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, like maybe there's a bit of catharsis you could have got out of that. You know what I mean? Like, I did it. I've saved the day, and then you just look around the room. You're like, okay, I'm still at home.
And for those uninitiated, perhaps you could go into a bigger depth of these role-playing games?
Sure. So role-playing games are games in which essentially you sit around a table, or you can do it via distance now, but traditionally sitting around a table, you have a character you've created, and you generally have a facilitator or game master, or sometimes known as a dungeon master, depending on the game, and they are sort of presenting situations and obstacles for the players to sort of work together to overcome. So traditionally in things like Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, you might be playing, elves and dwarves and humans as a party, and there might be some big dragon to face. And you might pull into a town, and the games master will tell you what's happening in the town. And instead of essentially the boundaries of the town already built, you can just ask questions, and the game is very sort of fluid and open to sort of interpretation. So a player might want to do something that the game master hadn't planned for, but they can roll with it and sort of be flexible and give that person a space to sort of explore that idea, which is really interesting psychologically for me.
Okay. So speaking of psychologically, I'm sure a lot of listeners are wondering, so what connections does your expertise in psychology have with these board games or tabletop games?
Yeah, so I mean, I can speak mostly to the tabletop role-playing games. Yep. So in terms of role-playing games, a lot of the time when we are playing games, we are interacting with each other. So there's some of the research in terms of role-playing games have shown that when you're playing a game like that, there are sort of three frames or three key frames that we've talked about that is talked about. One is the frame of the person. You're playing the game. Then the next frame is the rules of the game. So the person has got to be in the real world, but then they've got to use the rules of the game to play. And the third frame is actually the character or the content in the world. And for a game to work, you sort of got to be moving between those three frames pretty easily without problem. And in doing that, what's happening is you're sort of creating a little circle of play in which, when you're playing, it's not you that's in the game, it's your character that's in the game. So there's a little degree of separation. And when you've got that degree of separation, it seems that people seem to be a bit more open to sort of experimenting with things. Now, we've all been kids, and when we're playing, we know that we can just sort of do things that we wouldn't normally do in a play world. We can experiment, we can succeed, we can fail, but failing doesn't mean the end of the world in play states. So when you're playing in these sort of role-playing games, which is sort of structured storytelling, you can start doing things like talking with other players and coming up with plans and socializing in a way that some people might not normally feel comfortable doing outside of the game. And it might be just sort of like a little bit of distance, a degree of separation, and then sort of putting this stuff on the character that might help people explore socialization in a way. So I can give you an example. So let's say that you have very high social anxiety normally in the world, and I understand this myself. All right, so if you get put into a social situation and you're around lots of people, two key things are going to happen particularly. One is going to be your social anxiety is going to start skyrocketing when you're in this situation. And number two, you're going to be thinking about, how do I get out of this situation as soon as possible, and how do I do so in a way that won't attract too much attention? So you might find a way out of the situation, but next time you get in that situation, you'll use that strategy to get out again almost immediately. All right. So what happens is that you can build up these strategies, and they work really well at getting out of situations. But what they mean is that whenever those situations arise, you're never there to slowly build that muscle or those skills up, because you're always pulling yourself out immediately from that situation. It's sort of like if you're afraid of, let's say, dogs. And every time you see a dog, you just instantly avoid the dog. You're never around a dog anymore to be able to sort of slowly get conditioned to the fact that some dogs are okay. You know, so it's you might have one bad experience with a dog, and then you'll never put yourself in a situation where you'll have an experience with a dog which could turn into a good thing, because you always remove yourself from that situation. That's sort of what's happening sort of with social anxiety. So people remove themselves from those situations, and they'll never build up that skill. So if you're playing a role-playing game in which, let's say, in real life, that is something that you find difficult, if you sit around a table with people and you're playing a game, now it's your character doing it. It's not you. So if your character says something silly, it's not the end of the world, because it's just your character. It's not you. And the general nature of sitting around a table with people anyway and playing these games is generally people are really supportive of each other in these games anyway. I've joined games where I don't know the people, and immediately people are very friendly and helpful. And it's sort of a nice, safe sort of play space where people can experiment and try new things and feel comfortable in ways that they might not in their normal life.
So you talk about, like a very friendly, welcoming environment. Do you think that is more related to this kind of like the structure of the game itself, or rather, does it attract people who are predispositioned in that way in the first place? Oh,
it's like a chicken or egg thing. Yeah. No, so, I mean, again, really, more research is probably needed to really pry that question apart. But I've introduced people to these games that have never played these games before and not really interested in role-playing games. and they find the environment very, very helpful. So I think regardless of whether you're drawn to it or not, a lot of these tables are very helpful. So in role-playing games, a lot of the time we have what's called a session zero. People might not know what that is. So essentially what a session zero is if I'm setting up a game, say it's Dungeons & Dragons or Wonder Home or some of these great role-playing games that are around, I will invite people around and I will talk to them beforehand, and we will all sort of figure out what they want to accomplish with the game, what they want to do, what are things that they'll create their character. They'll figure out the things that they want their character to do and they want to experience in this game. And they'll also might highlight to you, go, hey, look, Shaun, I'm very happy to play this game, but I'm not comfortable with this topic. And it's like, great, we won't tackle this topic. We will stay away from it. And they might say, also, I'm okay with this topic happening off camera, essentially, but not something that we engage with directly. And so we can talk about these things and put in these sort of safety mechanisms so that people can play and not worry about something coming up that maybe that's very strongly in their lives that might create a lot of anxiety or worry. So you can sort of create these sort of spaces where people can sit down and play, and from game one, everyone's on the same page about things that are sort of out of limits, out of bounds, and also they can sort of feel comfortable knowing, oh, we're all just playing a game together and bouncing off each other, sort of like an improv session. So you're sort of like doing improvisational talking and actions, but you've got this sort of loose framework of rules so that if you've never done that sort of stuff before, it doesn't feel too alien for you to be able to do.
I mean, that's kind of interesting because, when you set, like setting these social rules beforehand, like in a lot of, real world social interactions, you don't get the benefit of having these set beforehand. And they're kind of just more like, what's the phrase for it? Inferred. But here, it's kind of like clearly laid out beforehand. Do you reckon that in some way helps people, build their understanding of how to better interact with others in social settings outside of the game?
I'd suggest yes, and the reason why I'd suggest yes is that it's a great question too. That's definitely one of the things we're looking at, particularly is the reason is that a lot of the time, if you've got something on your mind that you're worried about, that worry can overtake your attention to feeling comfortable in a moment with other people, and you might be on edge about that thing a lot of the time. If you can remove the worry of that thing coming up in a situation, like directly through, like, say, session zero, for instance, it might help people feel just more open and comfortable to just sort of sit there and be themselves a bit more. I know that sounds strange, like be themselves a bit more when they're playing a character, but sometimes, a lot of times, we have a lot of defense mechanisms up and we do a lot of things in our daily lives that are sort of doing things for the purpose of other people or how we look or how we want other people to see us. And playing a game sometimes can sort of, I know it sounds strange, by playing a character, you can sort of pull away some of those masks at times and just sort of do something you want to do a bit more. If you want to play a hero that you want to be, you can be more like that hero in the game. And there's research that has shown that, look, so if you do a test with people beforehand about evaluations of themselves in terms of how they feel and what their goals are, they report a certain way. Then you have them play a game like Dungeons & Dragons or another role-playing game in which they're playing an idealized character of theirs, right? And then afterwards, you test them. Even a few days later, you find that their self-evaluations now are more closely aligned to the character that they wanted to play as opposed to as opposed to what they were mentioning prior. So playing the game and playing a character that you want to be at times can actually help people sort of get closer to those idealized versions of themselves.
So it's often been cited, quite a few times, that New Zealand does have a big mental health problem, particularly among a lot of the younger populations. Do you think that the application or participation in these role-playing games could help improve the situation, perhaps?
And another great question, and definitely something that is one of the core focuses of the lab too. So at GRAIL, we're looking at what mechanisms and what things are going on under the surface of gaming. People are gaming and they're enjoying gaming anyway, but what's happening anyway by default? So is there, like you say, like we're talking about the social anxiety reduction, interpersonal skills being improved? So in terms of whether this can help people with their mental health problems, it's really interesting because we launched the lab in August and we did an outreach at Armageddon, the pop culture show, which is sort of our people, right? It makes sense. Yeah. And people came up and talked to us, and we met a lot of people who are playing games and reporting that they're getting those benefits from playing games. But also, we did a little bit of press, and people were contacting us from all around the country, therapists, teachers, etc., who have been trying to incorporate games into their work to help people sort of work through problems. So in psychology, for instance, there's a thing called psychodrama, which is a type of role play in which you're going to play a family member or something like that, and you're going to solve a problem, and it's improv, but it's not like you're not rolling d20s and critical hits, etc. But so there are a natural tangents and overlap within psychology already, and with knowing that people are already trying to do these things in the country on their own, it just helps us understand that a lot of practitioners already notice the benefit of these sort of games or suspect it. So it would be really useful for someone or some people to start studying that in the context of Aotearoa and just figuring out, hey, so as you say, there are some, New Zealand has some mental health issues. So how do we help that? Is there another tool that we can add to that toolbox? It's not a fix-all, it's not a panacea, it's not going to be the only solution, but if you're working with someone and they're not responding to this type of therapy, what about if we got them in group therapy of playing, let's say, Dungeons and Dragons? And we don't necessarily have to be have any other underlying concern. We're not trying to necessarily, manifest your inner demons that you're fighting in the game. That might be a strategy you could do. But I'm just saying, just playing the game, just going through. So in our study, we're going to be looking at these games and seeing what's happening when people play these games. And that way, if we can find out what effects are happening, we can log that, we can record it, we can quantify it, and then we can provide that information to practitioners, but mainly legislative bodies and ministries to help them say, hey, look, this might actually provide real benefit for people. So it might make sense to increase access to these things, whether that being getting more books or games to libraries or schools, and or providing funding or opportunities for organisations to provide sessions for people. So that's one of the overall aims. I hope I didn't babble on too much on that one.
No, that sounded very interesting in my opinion. And also, do you reckon that this might possibly lead to the development? So currently, D&D sounds like a great tool for people to explore different, social interactions and stuff. But do you reckon also perhaps there's the potential for maybe purpose-made role-playing tools specifically to operate in the field of psychology?
Really. I mean, I'm laughing because again, that's another thing we're looking at. Great question. Yeah. So now I will preface this a little bit by saying, in my prior work with video games, I have found that science-developed video games are awful. Yeah. So it's a bunch of scientists or psychologists developing a game. For the most part, some of them are good, but for the most part, they feel like they come out, in 2023 and they look like they were made in 1993 or something like that, right? The mechanics don't work. So the problem with developing sort of an artistic output, but with a sort of a practical learning outcome in mind first, is that people might forget the aesthetics of what and the importance of enjoyability in a game. What makes a game fun, as opposed to we want someone to learn this, right? So if that's the first point, and you're going back from there, you might have already defeated your problem, if that makes sense. Yeah. So, but on that point, I'm just prefacing that and saying, yes, that I've experienced that in the video game world. Now, in the tabletop role-playing game world, there are games that are developed. So, Game to Grow are a therapeutic organisation in the United States, and they put out a game system called Critical Core, which is a whole bunch of modules built around things like addressing neurodiversity at the table, ADHD, spectrum, people on the spectrum, social anxiety, but just sort of shaping the game and giving instructions to the game facilitator or game master in a way that sort of ensures that you're not shutting people down or providing too much stimulation or not enough stimulation, and just sort of helping people navigate this sort of play space in a way that they might actually maximize benefits. So we've got that at the lab. I haven't even had a chance to look at it yet. It's up on the shelf, and I'm desperately trying to look at it. I'm talking with someone from Student Support, Storm, from down in Canterbury, University of Canterbury, who's doing work with people with social anxiety, students down there by playing D&D. So we're going to have a big talk and read through the books together and sort of see what we see.
Okay. does sound like it has some potential, because there are a few notable examples of, like tools developed from, existing games to support, beyond just like hobbies. Like, for instance, Minecraft released their own educational edition to help teach like concepts. Perhaps on that topic, do you reckon there's also like a place for these tabletop role-playing games to serve an educational purpose as well?
Yeah, again, you're hitting all the sides on my D20 here. So the New Zealand Council of Educational Research a few years ago put out a big series of reports, and one big report looking at gaming and learning in New Zealand and Aotearoa. And what they found was that games in general are very helpful, and they covered role-playing games and board games in this. But one thing that they found is, while that they are helpful in students' reports of learning and in teachers' reports of engagement, is that a lot of the people that were doing it sort of felt like islands unto themselves. So it might be one person on a faculty in a school is doing it, and no one else really knows what they're doing, and they might go, "What are you doing? Dungeons and Dragons? That's silly. Teach them this." So one of the things that report from the New Zealand Council of Educational Research came out with was saying, look, people are feeling a little bit isolated. So one of the things with GRAIL is that we've opened up, we're trying to do community outreach. Thank you so much for inviting us on. This is really part of one of the things we want to do.
It's a pleasure to have you, by the way.
Cheers. So we want to connect with people and talk with people about what we're doing, talk with people who might be interested in gaming, people who might be interested in psychology, and see if there's some overlap from either side there. So if you're a gamer and some elements of psychology might interest you when you're gaming, or you might be into psychology and some interests of games, some elements of gaming might be of interest. But also connecting to, as I mentioned a little bit before, was other practitioners and teachers out there who are doing things who maybe didn't know about other people. So it's sort of like talking with people together and sort of getting them in contact with each other. And it's just a way to help facilitate a larger conversation with maybe an idea of maybe doing some conferences and get-togethers down the line of just all the people working together and doing this sort of thing, which would be great for New Zealand, I hope. But we'll see how that goes.
And another branch question in that subject, I also have known that in these tabletop games, there's also a lot of, you can work on your literacy skills quite a lot, because it's a storytelling game. You create stories, as you've said. And also, I believe there's a lot of rules, mathematics, crunching of numbers. Do you reckon it can also target these aspects of someone's education, or, children's educations and adults alike?
Absolutely. All absolutely fantastic questions. So yes, in short to answer, yes, and I'll answer in a longer version of that. Games that incorporate spreadsheets, like Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, sort of spreadsheet heavy, or Pathfinder, for instance. You're doing mathematics, you're rolling dice, you're adding proficiencies, you're doing all these different things in a game. And the research that we've seen does suggest that people are actually improving their skills and getting more confident with things. There are teachers have talked about, students that maybe were struggling with things, but they get them playing a role-playing game where they've got a character sheet and they're doing the calculations of what they can do and not, and what the hit points of the enemy are, and these sort of things. And they find that these people start getting confidence with numbers that they didn't have before, and it actually gets them involved in let's say, the mathematics class at school. You mentioned before Minecraft having educational resources. Other video games, such as Assassin's Creed and things like that, do educational versions.
An educational version of Assassin's Creed? I didn't know about that.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they've got them for learning, and they're free to download. So you don't have to buy them. If you want to go to ancient Egypt and just do a tour. So it takes out all of the sort of the fighting.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of a tour, and you're walking through 3D representations of these worlds. If you want to go to ancient Greece and go see the Parthenon, and it's, you're walking around with an actual guide in the game. It's really, really interesting.
Wow.
But then if we take that into role-playing games, there are games as well where you can sort of set it up in a historical setting, for instance. So we've got a game at the lab called Aegon, which is a Greek setting game. So if you're so inclined, you can, and you're knowledgeable in the area, you can sort of build a little campaign or a story around sort of Greek mythology and Greek events to help players explore this in a way that might benefit them. So I was talking with a lecturer, Dr. Emily Friedman from the United States, and she's great, and she is running a game called Good Society over there. Now, she teaches 18th century literature and things like that, 18th, 19th century literature. And Good Society is a Jane Austen role-playing game, essentially. So you are playing in this world. And she's finding that it's very, very helpful to have people play in this world, learn the sort of vocabulary of the time, going through the customs in real, as role-playing the customs of the day. And then when you're reading the books and things like that, everything connects a lot more because you've actually practically done it a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like introducing people to, different kinds of literature that they wouldn't normally engage with could help, I guess, build interest in, some of these great pieces of work from prior times. Particularly, like, when it comes to, the storytelling aspect of these tabletop games require you to come up with this kind of creative energy that would be expressed in books. Some people, I've even heard, like, sometimes people who go on from Dungeons and Dragons, like, write their own pieces of literature based off it. Like, this year, one of the top movies of the year was the new Dungeon of Dragons movie.
Yeah. And look, I mean, like, if anyone has got any friends who are like D&D mad or role-playing game mad, we can be a little bit insufferable at times, because if you get us talking about our campaign, we will talk for ages about, Bolfer, my wizard from the north, whatever it is, and I'll be just telling all these stories that only other people in the campaign know this story. So but it feels very personal and unique, and you own it, and like you're part of this incredibly fun, collaborative storytelling experience where we're building on each other's ideas, and the dice is helping randomize some of the encounters and what's happening. So we have to think on our feet and utilize and problem solve real time in a sort of in a play space, which is I think relatively unique, because a lot of the time, even if you're using miniatures and maps, you're still using so much of your imagination to try and solve these problems. It's a really interesting play area.
So, in these tabletop games, they definitely have, in some ways, quite extensive rule lists. There's a lot of different things to remember. There's a lot of locations to remember. Do you reckon that this could also help with the field of memory, cognition, perhaps, people who may be suffering from neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's?
Look, you're asking so many great questions. Absolutely. The first part I'll talk about is memory. So let's say, for years, if you're doing, let's say, a law degree, there's research that has shown that if you put an article of law, right, with all the points in it, on a bit of paper and say, hey, Martin, memorize this, all right? You're going to do an okay job at that if you're diligent, right? But if I give you a case study or a story that incorporates all those pieces within the story, that is going to be much better, because what's happened is you've put a narrative into it, and now you can remember that, and it's like a chain in your brain. Your brain works by pictures and stories, so you can now remember this whole article much better in general than if I just gave you a piece of paper that was a dry piece of information. So when you think about how we learn in a university, for instance, sometimes the work can feel a little dry, right? So can playing games that incorporate elements of learning or things that we need to learn, can that increase memory and cognitive ability? The research at the moment is suggesting absolutely yes, but we just need to do much more research on this sort of stuff. I think the reason why there's not tons of research at the moment yet is that during the 80s there was a big satanic panic with Dungeons and Dragons, in which society sort of like blamed all of society's ills on Dungeons and Dragons and people being wizards and warlocks and things like that. And it might have chased a lot of funding and sort of startup research that would have happened in the 80s to other areas like video games, etc. That while they did get the hammer later on, that weren't as bad as as Dungeons and Dragons got it. So I think that research on memory, learning is all happening, and we're hoping to be part of that. But specifically in here in Aotearoa, yeah. And you had another part to your question, but I talked for like 25 minutes there, and I can't remember what the second part of the question was.
Well, was it about promoting it to perhaps treat Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative conditions, perhaps even extending to, maybe supporting these games within retirement home facilities and such, to help support people's later life?
Absolutely. So there is research. So there's longitudinal studies from Scotland, for instance, that have looked at board games. Now, these are sort of traditional board games, not the modern ones.
Yeah.
But so board games, so that includes things like Monopoly, Scrabble, Sudoku, crosswords, things like this, checkers, games at the table that you can play. And they found that for people who've played them throughout their lives and continue to play them into their older years, they find that they have a lesser rate of things like dementia. And it seems to act like somewhat of a buffer for ages, I think 71 to 77 for this.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting in terms of as a possible tool to just keep brain healthy going forward. But again, more research needs to be done because, in science, the catchphrase correlation does not equal causation. So you have to do some experimental work in terms of understanding how that works. I mean, why I got into studying role-playing games was I was playing a solo role-playing game called 1,000-Year-Old Vampire. I don't know if you know this, but so it's a game, it's a journal, it's beautiful, in which you play a vampire, you create a vampire, and you start off with several key memories. And the longer you play, the more you lose your memories and your skills, right? So, and towards the end, you've lost all your memories and all your skills, and now you're moreless, and it's the end of your vampire's life. And I played this game. I felt really empathetic towards this vampire. I know it's a vampire doing silly things, but the concept of losing your memory and losing yourself and not being able to remember who you were was really interesting, and I hadn't really experienced it in gaming before. And I thought, because I've worked in community health outside of work, I've worked in hospitals, and I've worked with end-of-life care, and I've worked with people who are going through those experiences in real life, losing their memory. And while I'm not sure a game like that would help someone going through that, it might be able to help people empathize. So staff or family members understand the concept, because one thing I've noticed a lot is it can be really hard for family to connect with these sort of things or understand what's going on, and just go, so-and-so, that they've lost their memory, they don't remember me, or they're in and out, and it can get really frustrating. And I know that sounds hard, but I've seen it, and it's hard because people aren't, we're not trained to deal with this, losing a loved one while they're still here at the same time. It's really difficult. So maybe games like this, if people are open to them, can help people just sort of, walk a mile in their shoes a little bit, and just provide some understanding of their experience a little bit. Maybe. And that was just a thought that went through my head when I played the game. And since I'm already, teaching psychology and doing video game work, I was like, I think there's something here. And then when I started digging, all the stuff that we've been talking about sort of became clear. And I was like, all right, so there is definitely a space for us to work in here in Aotearoa.
And on a personal note, I often like to take a board game when I go visit my lovely great aunt. She's in her late 80s. And when I play with her, I notice that there's almost an increased amount of mental acuity, more engagement. And as I said, I feel like it could definitely have a positive influence towards people of older ages directly as well. Including also the people who support and live with them as well.
It totally makes sense. So in psych, there's a thing called melodic intonation therapy, which is a type of therapy that you can provide music to people who are, so let's say they've got dementia. And there are different pathways in the brain where the brain connects to different areas. So, different, personality and identity and things like that. And sometimes if you're listening to music, some of the connections might go a different route. So if you have dementia, there might be plaques in your connections between your neurons, which means that it might be very difficult for sort of signals to get through to certain areas as normal. But sometimes music, for instance, can, for a moment, provide a different way for those signals to go in large part, and the people sort of come out of their shell a little bit more, or maybe completely. And there's some amazing videos online of therapies where that's happened. And I've seen this in work as well, in place. So games very well. Like you're saying, sitting down and just playing, it might just give people a little sort of access to parts of their brain or different pathways that haven't been used for a while, that just lets them be a kid again, or lets them play and maybe experience part of their everyday experience that they sort of, it has been locked off a little bit just through age.
And you spoke quite a bit about collaboration and stuff. So how is the research community in this space interconnecting with one another and sharing to progress within this field of research?
So, in terms of what, I'm going to mention that New Zealand Council of Educational Research again, when they were talking about practitioners, teachers and therapists, etc., feeling like islands unto themselves, I think a lot of researchers have felt that way as well. It's a growing research body, so it's a growing list of professionals who are doing things. Everyone I've talked to has been really, really welcoming and helpful. But it's sort of like when you're standing before a very, very big mountain, you feel very, very small and meek. Yep. And you're like, wow, there's a lot of stuff to scale. Like, there's a peak there. How many peaks here? So at the moment, I mean, we've just opened the lab up. We're talking with other people. We're looking for research partnerships. So, for instance, been talking with Gina at the classics department there about board games and Greek mythology, because she's been doing some great work there with sort of doing some interactive video work with Greek history and themes and stories, and seeing if we can have some overlap there and add some value. But across, I've been talking, I was down in Victoria not long ago, talking with Dylan Horrocks and Hamish Cameron from the classics department there, but Dylan is in design. And they're very interested, and especially with their students who are doing some incredible work down there in designing role-playing games that are sort of looking at different elements of identity, for instance. So let's say you might not feel comfortable expressing your identity in social life fully. You might find it more comfortable to do so in a game, and that might help you become more confident outside of it. So I'm just talking with people locally in New Zealand, researchers. It's going really good, and people are really welcome and open to it. And the fact that we've got a lab here at Massey has been something that we did a little bit of press when we opened in August, and it was only supposed to be local press, just for Manawatu area, and it went nationwide and it went globally, and it was just unbelievable. I wasn't expecting that to happen. So I've just been getting contact from people all around the world who are doing research, who are interested in this sort of stuff. So it's just a new job trying to manage that, and just stay in contact with lots of other people. Okay.
You also, earlier, when we talked about the mechanics of the game, you've got what you talked about as the players, but then you've also got the dungeon master.
Yes.
Could you elaborate more on, because they seem quite different roles in some ways, how these different roles have different effects on the psychologically on the people participating in them?
Sure. So different games have got different roles. So there are some role-playing games that don't have a game master or dungeon master, and it's all players at the table are telling the story together, and the game has prompts or random tables that you roll to direct the story. In terms of games that do have a game master or facilitator, depending on the game again, it can be different. So in Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, it's on a scale. So someone can be really directive with what the story is, what's going to be happening in the story, or someone can be sort of very loose and sort of have some ideas of where they want players to go. But I think modern gaming is sort of less about the dungeon master making rules and more about the dungeon master making rulings, meaning that the players can argue for something, and there might be rules as written for something, but if it's a cool moment and your players have been playing for 3 hours and, the person's jumped off the cliff to do something and they can't technically do that, to jump on the back of the dragon, sometimes you might go, well, give me a roll, and if you get it, we'll do it. And so sometimes it's just about using a bit of judgment in terms of helping create those moments for other players. And once you sort of get in the role of that, it can be really, really interesting. But, there are other games that use, let's say, a rule set called Powered by the Apocalypse. I know I'm throwing all these terms out. Anyone listening is probably, their brain is melting. But the Powered by the Apocalypse rule set is more narratively driven. So there's no D20s, it's just a couple of D6 dice. And in that game, you're just sort of making moves in the game. So I ran there. I was up at the Waikato role-playing convention a few weeks ago, and I ran a game called The Warren, which is essentially Watership Down, if you've read or seen Watership Down before. So some rabbits in a burrow, and I had that was a flood, so I was a game facilitator or game master there. And the players are making choices, and I'm just sort of like steering them or giving them information to help them go away that might provide the least resistance to get to a resolution. But I'm totally open to them going the complete other way that I was expecting. And in D&D, especially in my experience, it can be very hard to predict what players are going to do and where they're going to go. So there has to be a little bit of sort of agility from a DM at times in order to sort of roll with the punches and just... for instance, I remember specifically an instance where I was prepping. The players are all, this is D&D, players are all in a town, and set up the cave with the monster in it that's been attacking the town, and got them all prepped up, and they just said, actually, we're not going to go to the cave, we're going to go the other way. And I hadn't prepped anything for the other way, because I assumed that they would just be going into the cave, because it's all set up. So in that moment, you don't say no, because you're taking away player agency, and the big part about this sort of collaborative play space is people feel like they can control their own story. It's not fully controlled by the DM or Dungeon Master, but they can throw obstacles at you. But they, as a DM, you are providing the problems, and the players provide the solutions. So you just sort of improvise something on the way, or you prepare tons beforehand. It's up to you. I hope I've answered the question and not gone around in circles there.
Yeah, no, that brought up a few interesting points. And additionally, since you've expressed, all these different kinds of interactions the DM or Game Master may have, it makes one wonder, what are the strict benefits pertaining to this kind of role within the game? Like, what could someone, if they were thinking, hey, maybe I could start running a game like this, what kind of benefits might they experience specifically as the GM or DM?
Another really great question. It wasn't something I'd overly thought about until we did the launch of the lab, and I had a student from University of Canterbury email me. They're really interested in the study that we're doing, and they were just talking about how much they love preparing for a session. And they prepare stories and ideas and maps and things and lore building, so they're creating a world and a story that players can interact with. And we were just talking about things and about how it might be really interesting to look at if they wanted to do some postgrad study in the future. The idea of what exactly your question, the benefits of actually running games. So not just the preparation, but actually when you're running a game and sort of moving with the punches and solving problems live in a way that sort of encourages players to have fun as opposed to shut them down. So it's really, really interesting question. Not much of any research on that, but I think all the things that we've talked about, so cognitive ability, memory, learning, socialization, all these different things, I think could easily relate to that question too.
And you reckon it could also additionally help with organization and management, and perhaps even build some amount of leadership skills, perhaps?
Oh, look, you're talking my language, absolutely. So I DM a lot, or GM a lot. I run games a lot, and absolutely there is a you take on a leadership role at times, especially when you're getting new players used to the game, or if you're running a session 0, for instance, in which you're being responsible and you're providing tools to provide safety for players and make sure that we're not going to encounter anything they don't want to. And also at the table, sometimes disputes can occur at a table, and it's just sort of about navigating that, and you won't succeed every time. The first few times it's going to be tough, and you're like, I don't know if I handled that well. But because you're the DM, you'll be there next time running the game, and you just sort of, through experience in this game, you start to learn these skills. And because you're the DM, you can't do that social, when we talked about social anxiety, you can't remove yourself from the situation. You're in the game, you're running the game. So by the nature of being around these situations, you start to get used to them and more comfortable with them. And with any type of learning, the more that you practice something, the less you're thinking about it. And the less you're thinking about it, the more you can learn and get nuance on that situation and mastery of it. So, when you're first learning a tool or a task or something like that, it can be really tough because you're focusing so much on it. But the more that becomes second nature to you, the more that you can spend your attention on nuances of that, and the main part of it is sorted. So I think that approach to attention and learning could absolutely work in terms of game mastering or dungeon mastering, for sure.
I mean, these conflict resolution skills sound quite interesting, because sometimes you may have to deal with the unpleasant social scenario where two players may be disagreeing about stuff with one another. How do you reckon managing that can be achieved well?
So just in terms of, outside of psychology, and just as a gamer myself, running that, it's just about listening to people, making sure they're heard, and trying to pay attention to what it is that they're doing. So sometimes, I don't know if anyone listening can connect to this, but sometimes you end up arguing with someone not because of the point anymore, but just because you don't want the other person to win. Right?
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So
yeah, I think I can understand that.
So sometimes when that happens, where there's not really a lot of resolutions that would work, so you've got to sort of read the situation and figure out what's going on and see if you can provide a solution where everyone wins something. That can be tough in the moment because you're playing and everyone's pretending to be a dwarf or an elf, or like all of a sudden the ridiculous nature of it all shows its ugly head, and you're like, oh yeah, like we're all being wizards and dwarves, and these people are having an argument. So you just try and keep it within the world as well. So players can get annoyed with each other, try and redirect it into the characters might be getting annoyed with each other. Yeah. And that sort of puts it within that play space. And when you put it within that play space, we start dealing with that thing I talked about at the start, where succeeding or failing isn't end of the world. Yeah. Because it's within that space. So it's easier to succeed and fail because you can just get up again. Like in a game, you can jump off a cliff and break your legs, and a healer can come heal you. You can't do that in real life. Do you know what I mean? Like, no. So these sort of spaces can be really useful if you can direct those things into the game if possible, and just try and. But if people get really antagonized with each other, it's often useful to take a break and just sit down with people and make sure check in where everyone is. It doesn't. I don't think I've ever had like a major problem before, but I have heard of it at times. People can be people, and
obviously, yeah,
and But hope that makes sense.
No, that was a nice response to that question. So now that we've been through a lot of the details of this research that you're doing, what is your vision for the future of it? Where do you think it's heading? Where do you think what innovations could be possible within the next 10 years, let's say?
Well, 10 years in psychology is not long.
Well, it can be further than that. I just gave an arbitrary number.
No, that's great. So I'll mention why I think that the timeline can be longer is because in psychology, one thing that's really important is that you replicate a study. So if you do a study, you don't want to do one study and then base all of and then send that to legislators to legislate on, or whatever it is, or you want to be able to other people to do that study and find similar or the same results in different parts of the world or whatever it is, so that we can be sure that the effects that we're measuring are the things that we're talking about and that what we're expecting, what we're promoting. So we want to start doing some studies, and then want to be able to start replicating those studies to provide sort of robust, reliable source of data that can suggest that, hey, look, these games might be useful here, here, and here. I don't know what we'll find. I expect that we're going to find positive effects for learning, for all the things we've talked about, cognitive ability, memory, socialization, leadership, organization, all these different things. Now, if we do, let's say we do that, we do the research, we build up and become part of a sort of a global research community on this and do the replication, then long-term what this is about is being able to, as I mentioned before, help convince access to increase for these types of games so that people might get benefit from them. So if, I've been talking with people who've run D&D sessions in mental health facilities and things like that. And people have found really great benefits. Like there was a great article in New York Times recently about D&D in prisons. And we talked with people from prison who actually came up to us at Armageddon and said it was the best time of their week. The only time of their week that they could feel like they were happy and they weren't in prison was when they were playing D&D. So it's about increasing this sort of knowledge of what the positive effects of games will be if we find those, and make it just more known across the board so that different places have them as another tool in their toolbox, these games. So whether it be schools, and it's much more accessible in schools, even hospitals, care groups, community health. I mean, so I'm sure there are some support workers out there listening, and you can see sometimes the difficulty in, as a support worker myself in the past, you see that people often need help, but they don't qualify for the help. And it's like, okay, so the way for that to happen is for research to occur and to say that people with this combination of situation should be able to qualify for this stuff. And that's sort of what GRAIL is hoping to do, is build up this knowledge base so that we can help provide informed decision making and funding choices for places that would be able to provide the support for people in all walks of life, workplaces, hospitals, schools, wherever. And at the same time, we really want to be able to build up a research community here at Massey on campus. So we've got a lab over at the School of Psychology, and we've got a big community room at the back. We want people to just come and play games. So play board games, role-playing games. We want, whether people are interested in psychology or not, just come and play. And if you are interested in psychology, you can come and talk and maybe take part in research or even conduct research, whatever you want. But we just want to inject some vibrancy, especially over at the School of Psychology for our gaming lab.
Wow. Also, additionally, you brought up about playing in prison and the positive experience that previous inmates had with this. Do you reckon that this could perhaps... Could you elaborate a bit more on how the positive impact of having these kinds of games active within our judicial prison system? Sure.
I mean, prison and inmates conditioning mental health is a really important aspect of psychology that I'm not seeing enough research on, but whatever. But in terms of Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, the little research that has been done, and I'm talking more about now, I'll be leaning on that New York Times article or talks I've had with people who have come from prison, etc., is that depending on the prison, you might not be able to use dice.
Yeah.
Because dice are banned because they're linked to gambling.
Wow.
So what players will end up doing is making sticks or paper, like little paper things that they can spin and create their own randomized dice, essentially, alternatives. But what the reports of people are saying is that they're playing these games, they're finding creativity, especially on the DM side, that people are drawing maps, coming up with campaigns and ideas, and they're just creating a structured play that maybe they might not have outside of the game. And also socializing with other people, bringing people together. So the New York Times article was talking about how they would they would yell out what they were doing from their cells, and the DM would yell back what happens and things like that.
Wow.
Really interesting, right? Now these were death row inmates as well. Okay, so these are people who are, they're going through a lot, and they've done a lot of different things, but they found a refuge in Dungeons and Dragons, and they found this refuge by just sort of playing and exploring, being someone else for a bit. So I can imagine totally if you have had some problems and you've got some regrets and you are paying for those problems and you're paying for those errors, being able to be someone else for a bit and trying to be someone you wish you could be a bit more might be really helpful. Another thing people talk about when they play D&D, regardless of whether being in prison or not, is the idea that time can fly by sometimes. It's 3 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours. It's gone. The time is gone. Now imagine if you're in a place that you don't want to be.
Yeah.
Right? And you just have this enjoyment where you escape. It's like you're outside of the walls for 4 hours because you're playing D&D, but you've been in your cell your whole time. These sort of mental refuges might be very, very valuable just for well-being, never mind for all the other cognitive benefits. So I can expect that if research were to be done in the area, which is, again, it's on the board of things. I've got a board in the community room of questions that I'm looking to research or find other people who are interested to research with us. I think questions like that would be really useful to see what the potential benefits are there, because there are also content considerations to be made. If it's a violent game, what's appropriate and what's not. So it's about finding those boundaries and limits, and understanding what the games are providing and how they can provide it to different groups of people.
And also, further on that topic of prisoners and role-playing games, it also, a lot of the things you've talked about, you talked about social interactions, understanding rules, stuff like that. Do you reckon it can also, I know this is quite a thing to say, do you reckon it could maybe even have the potential to reduce someone's rate of, reoffending, understanding how better to fit into a society, how to engage more socially with others?
It's again a really good question. And Ross and I talked with some people who are running D&D up at a clinic up north for offenders, and they were running D&D. It was very successful. And they found that, and if you talk with people who work with people coming out of systems, whether it be mental health or prison systems, the difficulty is when they leave these institutions is finding community outside.
Yeah.
That can be really tough. But one thing we're talking about with these two counsellors was the idea that playing D&D in a institution, for instance, then you can transition out into the world where there are D&D groups. There are stores, there are play groups where you can go on a Tuesday. I think Valkyrie does that here. Valkyrie Games in Palmerston North. You can go and play D&D, just sit down, play games, meet people, just explore. And there is sort of an inbuilt community, gaming community, that wherever you go, that might be able to help facilitate and continue those sort of feelings of well-being and community that people might have been having whilst they were in an institution. So when I was up at Waikato Role Playing Guild's event called Convergence, that was something that I saw incredible up there, is that they provide role-playing sessions for people rurally. They do this. I think they get sporadic funding. They do an incredible job of just sort of creating community and spreading that community out and being welcoming to people. So if you come out of somewhere and you're feeling a bit alone, imagine if you had a Saturday role-playing game that you could go and play and just be your favourite character, the story in your head, or create a new character and tell stories together. I can see incredible benefit in terms of how that might play into integrating people back into community, into society, and thus how that might affect reoffending. Wow. I took a long way around to answer that question. I'm sorry, but yeah. Wow.
I mean that just, like, a lot of the stuff we've been discussing sounds really amazing and stuff, and from what I've heard, it sounds exciting that these tools will become more accessible in future, hopefully, to really bring a overall positive impact to many different facets within our society. Before we close off, I was wondering if you have any additional topics that you're itching to discuss.
Oh, I'm just trying to think. I think your questions have been absolutely fantastic. It's like you've read one of my private research documents. You haven't, but
no, I've just been, I've done this all on the spot.
Yeah, no, very, very good, and a really, really great question. So, and one other area that I think is very useful is. There are role-playing games developed by native peoples of different cultures. And these are great ways for people to sort of play games. There's one called Coyote and Crow that just won Role-Playing Game of the Year, which is written by native peoples of North America, and sort of introduces players to this science fiction fantasy world where North America wasn't colonized. And you can sort of go in and explore this culture that is sort of, added on to with fantasy elements. But also the game gives people a lot of tools to sort of help understand what's sacred to that culture, and so what you can play with and what you can't. And I think that's a conversation that's really useful to have for people that might not be open to that conversation normally, or might not be having that conversation, is that having a game where this is just happening by default. Doesn't feel like a learning experience. It's not a science developed game. It's a game where you're just learning the rules of the game. You're learning how to interact, and you learn that these sort of things are important. This language is important. These topics are important, and to be sacred with it, be respectful of it. And while you're playing your game, this might help, especially in a Aotearoa context. Might be really useful for storytelling here in New Zealand.
Great. Anyway, I've drained my question juice for the time being. I don't know how to describe it, but it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here.
It's been awesome. It's been really nice chatting. So I hope I haven't bored people too much. But look, if you ever want me to talk more about this stuff, I'm more than happy to come back.
So in case anyone has any further questions for Shaun over here or anything about that, would you be keen to drop some contact details?
Absolutely. So we're at the GRAIL Lab, like the Holy Grail Lab. You can email me at s.garea@massey.co.nz. So s.garea@massey.ac.nz. That's my email. I'm at the School of Psychology. You can come visit. I'll happy to show anyone around if they're interested, and just play a game, just whatever you like. Just would love to get more people involved in this thing and just talk to more people about their experiences with gaming.
Great. As I said, I hope you get a few more keen people eager to collaborate and discuss this exciting field of research in the field of psychology. It's a pleasure having you here. And in case you want to come on here and share some of your research within different fields, particularly if you're a maths student or any kind of student or any kind of researcher who's just got a great story to tell, feel free to contact me at martinallen111@gmail.com. MRATINALLEN 111, all lower caps, and I can put you here too, where Shaun is sitting right now. Currently it is 2:02, and the song that's coming up next is Okay, All Right, by Bridges.